Hello, Heather, and thank you very much for being here. We are very excited to talk to you about beauty as an ethical ideal. And that is also the subtitle of your, I think I have to say, very famous book, Perfect Me. It was written in 2018. I remember reading that it was completed already in 2016. So it's almost 10 years later. I would like to ask you to tell us what the main message of that book is, although it would be a lot of simplification going on, and also immediately afterwards how you look back to the whole project.
Main message of Perfect Me is that the way we value beauty has changed, and that's changing both how we think of ourselves, but also what we believe and what we do. So the main claim is that it's become an ethical ideal, and that just means something really quite simple, that it's now a dominant value framework, that how we look has become connected to who we are. It's the primary way that we judge ourselves and others, and that's changing the kind of ways that we behave. And there's a number of other arguments in the book about the way it's become a dominant value. It's a global ideal. It's happening to men as well as women. And I can talk a little bit more about those aspects as you want me to. But the main claim is that it's just changing who we think we are, because how we look has become, in a very real way, for very many of us, exceptionally important.
And looking back, of course, I think the book just about missed the explosion of TikTok and Instagram, although it caught something of it. How do you feel that this ethical ideal has progressed or has become more or less ingrained in society now?
Yeah, it's changed dramatically and kind of exponentially. As you say, it was just before everything blew up in social media. So Instagram is mentioned in the book twice, but TikTok not at all, and not as very important. So there's a one mention of selfie culture, but only as a kind of sense that we were getting to the point where we had to be camera ready all the time, but much less in that kind of the selfie posting. So social media has made appearance more important, but of course everything was completely escalated by the pandemic. So for the first time, irrespective of who you were communicating virtually, and therefore you were looking just like we are now, looking at your image, and that became completely normal. So for instance, demographics that I would have predicted when I wrote Perfect Me would never have been impacted by the beauty ideal. So middle-aged, powerful men, I thought that they would continue to live their lives and without ever really caring about how they looked. So maybe young men as they grew up would care, but that older demographic wouldn't. So it turns out after the pandemic that these men are now seeking treatments and tweakments from plastic surgeons, and presumably because for the first time, instead of just putting their suits on, going out the door, they were holding their board meetings online and they were watching themselves and feeling lacking.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. And in a way, I was thinking while reading the book that it's very easy when you talk about beauty ideals to think that they affect just women. And usually it's something that women do for men. But if you truly look around you, you see that it's no longer the case. I mean, a lot of men are also struggling with their body image. And there's a whole, regarding TikTok and Instagram, there's a whole phenomenon of building muscles that can be healthy, but in the same time can lead to being overly obsessive about your body. And first of all, what I wanted to say before asking you something is that you had me at the title with this book. This is how I decided to read the book. I read the title and I was okay. I'm so happy that someone talks about this from a philosophical standpoint, because I'm a former philosophy student and we usually talk about beauty. I don't know, Plato says this, Aristotle says that, but we don't talk about the current struggles with appearances. And I guess what I wanted to ask you is, when you decided to write the book, was there a feeling that was something missing? Or I don't know, you had some solutions in mind and you wanted to write about them. What was, maybe help us a little bit setting the context for the book?
Right. So, I mean, I guess full disclosure, I would not have been able to write this book had I been a junior member of faculty, only because I was already established and senior. Could I turn to the topic of beauty? Because, as you say, philosophy has largely ignored it, treated it as trivial, treated it as a problem that only silly women have. And yet it became really obvious to me. Previously, I spent over a decade working on issues of global ethics and global justice. And it gradually became obvious to me that this was just as much of a defining issue of how people were living, and just as important as some of the supposedly serious issues with regard to what makes people's lives go well. So the only reason that this wasn't being looked at by philosophers was their own prejudice. And that's a real failure, I think. So philosophy is supposed to be saying things about how we should live and what we value and what are good ways of life. And yet it was completely ignoring what was defining for very many people, including many philosophers who just deny it, in terms of what made their lives go well. And the more I started looking at it, the more I felt that it was, for very many, overwhelming. And I was still kind of struggling a little bit about whether I could write about this. I was at a global ethics conference, and a development scholar that I had known for a long time, I was saying, well, I'm thinking about writing about this. And I was expecting some judgment, as I had had quite a lot of judgment. And he just said to me, well, Heather, in the poorest townships in South Africa where I've been working, people are swapping their antiretrovirals for skin lightening cream. So this is absolutely something that you, as a global ethicist, can go and write about. And we are missing something. So, I mean, for me, I think that it has, at the time I was writing, I thought it was, something that philosophy had just ignored because of its own prejudice. But when you talked to policymakers and to parents, nobody doesn't know somebody that has struggled with appearance, whether it's in serious ways like anorexia, or in other ways, just normal ways. So it's become normal to think that we're dissatisfied with our bodies and that makes us feel bad. Well, that's quite an extraordinary difference from the way that previous generations felt. And the kind of neglect from academia because they thought it's trivial means that we haven't actually done our duty to policy and to the public at large, because we failed to call out what's happening with how we relate to our appearance.
Or what I also noticed is that we sometimes tend to think that if we understand the problem and talk about it, it's enough. And especially, I don't know, if we say this is just a convention, beauty is just a convention, a social norm. Therefore, if you understand that this is a social norm and you can be critical about it, you can ignore it. And I think this is why your book was so impactful for me, because I understood for the first time that it's very important to not see beauty ideals as social norms, but rather as moral norms. Because if you do this, you understand that it's not that easy to resist it. If it's a social norm, of course, you look at it from the exterior and say, okay, I choose to engage with it or not. But if it's a moral norm, it's something you internalized already, even if you realize it or not. And it's way harder to say, this doesn't impact me, this doesn't affect me. So yeah, this is something I noticed about the book, and I wanted to, I don't know, maybe if you want to develop more about the difference between social norms and moral norms, and why is this important to acknowledge?
Right. So I think that psychologists and sociologists have been much better than philosophers at recognizing how important appearance was. But as you say, all that they can do is say, well, this is a social phenomena. And of course, what philosophy brings to the puzzle, what I bring, is that claim that this is not a mere social norm. This is a moral norm, an ethical ideal, which means that not only have we internalized it, but we've also bought into the notion that if we succeed at this, then we will be successful more generally. So to use like some more old-fashioned sort of Aristotelian terms, we will achieve the goods of the good life. So we've increasingly bought into not just the ideal that this will be instrumentally valuable, it will help us achieve things, but that it is absolutely connected to making life go well. So it will give us better relationships, better friendships, better careers, but also it's connected to our identity. So attaching to the ideal are the moral emotions of shame and praise. And this is where it cuts so deep. When you understand it's an ethical ideal, you can see why it's so difficult to give up on it. Even if you understand those critiques, it's not simple or easy to stop caring about it, precisely because we now live in a world where we do think our bodies are ourselves and where to give up on it. So those who take it seriously talk about when they give up on it, it's almost a form of grief, because you're not just giving up on something that's unimportant. You're giving up on your future self. You're giving up on the values and how you are seen. And of course, ethical ideals are never individual. They're shared ideals. So even if you chose as an individual to give up on it, which I think is almost impossible, that doesn't mean that you would not be judged for it and treated in those ways. So because of the ethical nature, it's both intrinsically and instrumentally valuable, and it cuts deep. So shame, we know, is an exceptionally powerful emotion, and to fail at the beauty ideal is to invoke self-shame and to be shamed by others.
So maybe we can now say a few words about what it is that beauty means in these. So before we embrace it, or we stand critically next to it, or like you said, when we shame others in its name or because of it, how would you define beauty, and what does it consist of? Because you break it down into smaller, more observable features. Can you say a few words about that?
So the beauty ideal for women has 4 features: thinness, firmness, smoothness, and youth. And here I'm just talking about how the body looks, right? We're talking about the physical appearance of the body. And often you asked about how it's changed. As we move more and more into selfie culture, the body and face as it's perceived in a 2-dimensional screen. So not even real flesh and blood bodies, but images of bodies. So thinness, firmness, smoothness, and youth are the 4 features. And they are about a range. So there's not a single blueprint of the ideal body. So if you think back to not this summer, but the summer before, when Barbie was everywhere, right? So you don't have to be the stereotypical Margot Robbie Barbie, but you do have to be one of those Barbies. So you can be thin in very many different ways. You can be athletically thin. You can be catwalk thin. You can be thin with curves, but it's thinness in some places, particularly waists, for instance. Firmness. So some people think, the kind of curvy, firm body means that we're having more inclusive beauty ideals, but we're really not. Firmness is even more demanding than thinness alone. And then smoothness is, again, some of it relates to firmness and the right curves in the right places, but some of it is also about the way that our understandings of skin tone have changed. So we're not looking for human touchable skin. We're almost looking for plastic perfection. So flawless, poreless, radiant skin, skin that no human being ever has. And then youth, a long-standing feature of beauty ideals. So you asked me earlier, and I failed to respond about men. So it's worth noting that only one feature tracks for men, and that's tallness. So men are doing an awful lot more around their appearance.
But are you, Octave?
Oh.
No. Okay. You're safe.
I live in the Netherlands, so I'm Romanian, and I live in the Netherlands, and all the Dutchmen are proverbially very tall. So I've just resigned. I wear. This is really true. I recently bought barefoot shoes. You know what barefoot shoes are? They're supposed to be healthier because you walk like I'm even tinier with barefoot shoes. I have to admit. I just realized now I'm looking much more upwards to all my colleagues. But anyway, that's for a different show. But maybe just hook up a question there. So this generalized ideal that can be decomposed into these features is very clearly not the same for men. And does that mean that there is no tallness aside? Does that mean that there is no clearly defined ideal for men, tallness aside?
It does. So it's much for women. This tracks globally. So you will see, whether you are in a covered culture or a non-covered culture, right? We're still having all of the ideals are tracking in the same way, and places that used to, for instance, value fatter figures no longer do. So it's not the case that it's the same in every instance, but it is the case that the ideal is converging and that these features are evident everywhere. So for men, there are still places where it just doesn't track for men. Like men are covered, they're bearded. It seems to be less of a thing. So there are places where the kind of muscled ideal, the buff ideal, is becoming very dominant, and where that's true, it looks quite similar to the female ideal. It's about firmness, smoothness, and youth, not thinness, but not fatness either, right? It's quite a distinctive. So where it's happening, it's very dominant, but it isn't happening globally. There are very many places where men's beauty and attractiveness is not a thing. So in that regard, it's less dominant, but it doesn't feel less dominant for those men who happen to be in the beauty culture.
It could be in certain domains. I think I'm thinking now about, I don't know, actors from Hollywood that are starting to do skincare treatments and Botox and all that. So probably if you're a man who works in, I don't know, doing movies or being a model, well, then of course you're also affected about skincare.
Right, so Dinah Berkowitz talks about America being now a Botox nation, where it's not just women, it's men, and across demographics, really limited by what you can afford rather than what you aspire to. And I think we're seeing this across very many cultures in the West, where she talks about Botox being like teeth cleaning, required rather than optional, and that's definitely spreading, particularly so different places claim to be the cosmetic surgery capital of the world. Sometimes it's Brazil, sometimes it's South Korea, sometimes it's Lebanon, but it's certainly the case that what is normal is rising, and in many places that includes things that were not normal a very short amount of time ago. And people often focus on cosmetic procedures or Botox, but actually if you look at some of the more mundane practices, you can kind of see how the global ideal changes beauty practices into health and hygiene practices. So one that I talk about a lot in the book is body hair removal, because this is part of the smoothness thing. So it's not very long ago that we saw body hair removal as a beauty practice, right? It's optional, and actually there's different aesthetics. So if you go and look at 70s body hair, you will find both underarm hair and pubic hair on women, and you will not find that now. And you will hear people, and this is where I use some of the work by psychologists, people talk about body hair now as unclean, as disgusting, seen as abnormal and unnatural. So this is where the global ideal really matters. It's a different ideal from previous ideals, because it turns a beauty practice, something that's always adornment, into something that's required just to be normal. And we can start seeing that happening with other things. So with the Botox and the smoothness, we can start seeing signs of age in some places now being treated as something that's abnormal and unnatural, as grooming practices normalize what were previously adornment practices. So one of the claims I make in Perfect Me is that a global ideal is completely new and transformative. So it's not like we haven't done really horrible things to ourselves for beauty. We have, like we've bound feet, we've worn corsets, we've done extreme things to our bodies for beauty. But in every previous instance, they've obviously been for beauty. So nobody thought those tiny little lotus feet were natural or normal, right? That would be crazy. But that's because most people didn't have them, right? Women in the same culture were working in the fields, women in other cultures were doing different things. But a global ideal completely changes that. Suddenly,
isn't that
anything.
Yeah, but isn't that the capitalist logic where things become cheap, so they become the norm? So it's like it's entered the capitalist game, so it becomes cheaper. It's like inflation. It's almost the process of inflation. So where you could get along with just, I don't know, dyeing your hair, now you have to do Botox. And where you had to do Botox in movies, now you have to do both Botox and I don't know what's above Botox, something like that. Isn't this the same effect that we see on, let's say, the fact that everybody has a microwave. It used to be a very special thing that you have, and now everybody, if you don't have a microwave, how exactly are you living your life? Are we then not subjected to this ideal in the same way we're subjected to the economic system, right?
Yes, some of it is capitalism for sure. You can only be sold things that you didn't know you needed in a capitalist system,
Yeah.
of course. But it the fact that it's beauty we're being sold rather than something else is because we are valuing that over other things. So say it was, intelligence we were being sold. We might all be walking around with like little drips to, make sure we're rehydrated all the time so our brains work better. Or we might be buying, instead of Ozempic, we might be buying pills to increase our intelligence. So of course, this only works in a capitalist logic, but it's not just. So I often get to, is it just the beauty industry? And it's like, well, yes, of course, the beauty industry is making money from it. But the fact that the beauty industry is seen as recession-proof says more about what we value and that capitalism succeeded. And the fact that, go back to my earlier example, that people are willing to trade life-saving drugs for skin lightening, or that people are willing to undergo all kinds of risky practices. Buttock lifts being a really good example. We have fatalities from buttock lifts. This is because we're
Buttock lifts? What
because
is
of what
that?
we value.
Buttock.
Buttock lifts. So there are all kinds of cosmetic procedures, and some of them I would say are safe and routine. So breast implants, fairly safe and routine, right?
But it's still a surgery. Yeah.
Right, buttock implants much less safe and routine, and I've got a little gory description of why they're different from breast implants given to me by a cosmetic surgeon in the book. But just not to be too gorish, but if you just think about where your buttock implants are, and the fact that you can't see them to clean them, that you actually have to move your buttocks to stand up in a way that you don't have to move your breasts, and so on, you can understand why these are things that go wrong a lot and have all kinds of infections. And then other things that you might not be aware of, so things like tummy tucks often go wrong. So there are different risks in different places, and the fact that we're willing to do things that are exceptionally risky and that we're valuing over our health tells you more about how we're valuing beauty than it just being something that capitalism is pushing on us.
Yeah, it's something worth having, the risks, because it has a greater potential to, make our life better than just health. Health, nobody sees it, or at least it gives you the possibility to do things, but it's not that obvious that you have it. Whereas beauty, it's very, very clear that you have it or not.
But it also means that some of the things that we put in place to protect people from harm are just not working anymore. So informed consent, we move straight from medical practice into cosmetic practices. But in medical practices, we assume that people will put their health first and they'll only do things that are good for them. Whereas when it comes to cosmetic surgery, by the time you get to the point of seeking it out, you're already committed. And there are many reports where people will say it wouldn't have mattered what they'd said to me at the consent process. I was already all in. I was already committed. So our kind of the ethical safeguards we have that are designed to protect you from harm just don't work in this sense.
Why do you think we fail at doing campaigns and doing awareness campaigns about this? Because it seems to me, this is my intuition, that we talk about how this is risky, or we talk about how this is silly, or we talk about how this is not that important and it's superficial and we should focus on other things. But we know these things aren't working. So my question is, why do you think that is the case? And even if you already kind of explained it, and if you think there is something that could work instead of these methods that only make us either trying to reject them and not succeeding, or judging other people for doing what we are not doing and say, oh, but look what she's doing. I'm not doing that because I'm far superior, but actually in our mind, being jealous about that thing or wanting it ourselves.
I mean, so let me try and take it apart a little bit. So one question is, when we tell people it's superficial and it's trivial, they know it's not true now. So particularly when we tell our kids that, right? They know they're being judged by it. If you look at the evidence that's coming out about Lookism, it does make life go better. It's not just a kind of it doesn't make life everything go better. It doesn't deliver that kind of perfect life that it promises. But does appearance matter in our contemporary society? Yes, it does. People who, taller men and thinner women, sorry to come back to tallness, they do better. They earn more. It doesn't help you keep a long-term relationship, but it sure helps you start one, and so on. So there's a sense in which when we tell as we have done, tell people it's trivial or it's superficial, right? That's just not true, right? We need to start with being truthful about what it is, recognizing what beauty does and does not deliver. And then if we think it shouldn't, as very many of us think, so very many people think that if you are being interviewed for a job that has nothing to do with your appearance, you shouldn't get the job over somebody who's better qualified. Or if you're equally qualified, looks shouldn't come into it. But in fact, we know that that's not the case. So part of the reason that we haven't addressed this, I think, is that we don't want to believe this is true. So we've kept saying those things about, it's what's on the inside that counts. Don't judge a book by its cover. And we've just pretended that it's not the case that looks matter when they do. And they matter more and more as we live in a more visual and virtual society. So the first thing to do is that we need to stop pretending that they don't matter by wishing it away and recognise how much they matter, which is less than the person who thinks that they're going to suddenly have a perfect relationship by changing their looks. But they do matter. So we need to start by being realistic about that and not basically lying to our children. And that, I think, is why very many of the campaigns that are just kind of dismissing of beauty don't work. And there's also positive things about beauty. So philosophers have been very bad at recognizing that the body matters as well as the mind. But the body does matter, and the body is how we do very many of our most important relationships. The body that touches, that sees the other, that cares for the other. So I think some of it is also recognizing that our bodies matter. So I think we need to start with a kind of realization of just how much that matters. And then in terms of the beauty as an ethical ideal, so I talk about in the book the imagined self. And I think recognizing the power of that self that we're working towards, that self that we have in our heads when we're doing our dieting or our training or imagining ourselves in the new clothes that we've bought. It's not that we're imagining just that body, we're imagining that person living a life. And as it becomes more ingrained as an ethical ideal, it's increasingly the person being the person, not just looking like the person who looks a certain way, lives a certain way. So we need to recognize the whole power of that setup. And only if we do that can we start to begin to address it. And it's definitely not going to be by telling people, just, don't care about beauty. It doesn't matter when everybody knows that it does.
And what the costs are also of not caring.
So when I was reading, I felt the need to make a distinction, and I was wondering how you see if there is a distinction to be made there, because I thought maybe this is just my perspective as a man on not being that much concerned with the cosmetic products, but I think there's a distinction in the way we fault people or we blame people for not being beautiful, not conforming to the ideal. On the one hand, we have these sort of surgeries that seem like cheating. If you have enough money, you look at actresses that are very wealthy and they don't look their age, and that is blamed differently than the way people blame a perfectly normal individual that completely neglects his or her health and it has all kinds of medical problems and whatever. So I'm not saying either of these is justified or not. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. That's a different discussion. But would you say within the ideal of beauty, there's this distinction of beauty as a result of health and beauty as a result of interventions and money and weird sounding chemicals?
So while the ideal is global, how people's attitudes to it is culturally dependent. So what you're describing, the kind of cheating thing that you only do it in a certain way, that's a very kind of Northern European attitude. And it's a very different attitude, say, in the US, where people will not worry about paying for it and will talk about deserving it. And some of this is about having different kinds of health systems. So there's a sociologist, Deborah Gimlin, that writes about the difference between European attitudes to cosmetic surgery and American attitudes. And there, in the UK, where we have a national health service, people who want cosmetic surgery tend to justify it in terms of need, right? So, I need it because, I need it for confidence or because I'm not normal. Whereas in America, it will be the opposite. It will be, no, I've earned it. I'm going to pay for it, and I need it for my economic success. But it's much. Sorry, I used the word need then, and it's much less about need. It's more about, I can have this. So I think that lots of that cheating stuff, much less there in America. And often, as I've talked about elsewhere, lots of the times that we talk about health, it's often a cover for doing beauty in the right way. And often that is very kind of hierarchical, particularly on class lines. So one of the things that you notice is like middle class women, less so now as Botox and treatments and tweakments become more people are having them. But before, especially before Ozempic, right, you get middle class women saying that they'd lost weight in the right way by diet and exercise without recognizing just how expensive diet and exercise is. And you can't do exercise if you're working 2 jobs, and you might then save up for a quick trip to Turkey and liposuction. Right, the end is the same, but they will be justifying it in the kind of my process is the right process. And I think that lots of that discourse about health is just a way to justify within your particular social context the end, and the end is that thinner, firmer, smoother, younger body. But I've seen some of that. I think that rhetoric is changing, right? So the more common the practices become, the less it becomes cheating and more it becomes legitimate. So, for instance, like you can see, if you think about, Victorian women who were, they were pinching their cheeks and lips to get some redness in them, but they weren't using blusher and lipstick because that's what working women of the street used, and it marked them, right? Whereas
We
now,
wouldn't want that.
anything. You wouldn't want that. And, you used to even, so, I talked about body hair, but another interesting one is the way that nails have changed with the tech. And it used, painted nails used to be looked down on probably in my lifetime, and certainly my mother's lifetime. Not at all now, right? And you get all kinds of these processes. And the way that Botox has changed is really quite dramatic. And is now accepted in very, very many contexts. My dog is barking. Can you hear that? Or is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Hello
Shall
there.
I just let him out? And
Yeah,
then
Yes,
yeah,
of course.
sure.